It's Friday again, and it's time for the next in our Fanzine Friday series. Today, by request, we're taking a look at News from Bree. This is issue number 18 from 1976. Please stick around. I'm AZ Mountaineer, and this is our channel, Old School Rules, where we celebrate the community of old school gamers and grognards who like classic RPGs, miniatures, magazines, and everything that goes with it. Each week on the Fanzine Friday series, we take a fanzine from my collection off the shelf, and this week that's News from Bree, issue number 18 from May of 1976. This is done by Hartley Patterson. This one comes to us from the United Kingdom. This is a very classic, very early fanzine. As I mentioned, this one starts in this one is from 1976, and it's already on issue number 18. This one's a little different. I'm really looking forward to discussing it with you today. Hope you enjoy the video. Okay, so News from Bree, number 18. This one we're doing by request. Someone asked me to do this a couple weeks ago, and glad to do that. Anytime y'all have a question or a suggestion, please throw it in the comments down below. I read them all. Always happy to communicate with folks who are enjoying this content. So here's News from Bree. It is just regular, what's actually like doubles, like 11 and a half, 11 by 17 size paper, folded in half. So it's like a regular sized piece of paper, twice this wide, right? Folded in half with a staple through the middle. It's very thin. It's designed, right, to be folded in half so that you could mail it to someone, put their name here, and I guess maybe staple it. This one's kind of flat, so I'm trying to keep it flat at this point, but it's creased across the middle. You can tell it was once folded and either mailed or handed out to somebody. Okay, so here is the cover. You're getting into some really good sort of amateur art here. This guy's name is Chris Beaumont. I hope I'm saying that correctly, Chris. And he does a number of the illustrations. You've got this sort of spooky hand reaching out as this guy's riding across the land there. So this one again is different. As I said, it's a full-size piece of paper. He's got this concept where he's divided it up in sections 1 through 10, and so you see like the number 2 and 3 that's on here. Those are different sections, and each section is a different type of material. So 1 is the editorial, which he refers to as junk. Number 2 is sci-fi or fantasy information. Number 3 is news. 4, miniatures. 5, science fiction board games. 6, diplomacy. 7, fantasy board games. 8, freeform games. 9, Dungeons and Dragons content. And 10, postal games. And so, for example, in this episode, several of those aren't even here at all. His News from Bree editorial is basically just information about mailing addresses. He says he doesn't have a subscription. He says just send me some money and I'll send you, I'll send you one issue. And in particular, encourages that he'd like to do trading. So you send him your fanzine, he'll send you a copy of his fanzine. He also mentions that he just basically was giving these out to people for no cost because he wanted to build up interest and let people see the fanzine, like it, and maybe then he says later I could be able to do subscriptions. He also has a note here about back issues, which I think is important. So I don't have some of the earliest ones. In his comments, he says 1 through 12 are out of print, and he also says there's no game material in those. So I'll be particularly curious someday, hopefully, to get copies of those and understand a little bit better about what was going on in those earliest issues of News from Bree. He says people keep asking for issue 12, which had painting details or ideas for Minifig's Mythical Earth range, but he said, look, you can find that stuff other places, I guess. And then 13 through 16, he says those episodes are available, and he says have a little bit of game material in there. So enough about that. And then so he's got his notes here in number 2. He gives some ideas about some fiction you might want to read. And then in number 3, which is supposed to be news, he talks about some other fanzines that are out there, but none of them are really Dungeons and Dragons related fanzine. Perfidious Albion, says it has rules and map for some type of a war game. Europa, he says, is a board game, fanzine, and then Battleground, which is a wargaming fanzine. So nothing of particular interest to us. Okay, so then we looked at page 2 already in detail, talked about sci-fi, fantasy, and news. Then we're going to have some reviews, and in this issue they reviewed, just I think of interesting historical significance, Siege of Minas Tirith, which was a board game, obviously based on Tolkien. Dungeon, which is put out as a board game put out by TSR, which they liked quite a lot, and they say is a good board game for people who don't really have the desire or interest in diving into full-on Dungeons and Dragons. And then finally one called White Bear and Red Moon, which was put out by Chaosium, which is a board, as they say, a board game that tries to combine some elements of wargaming, a little bit of concepts of role-playing in with a board game, but it's basically a battle with chits that you move around. Then there's also a review of something called Ythri, Y-T-H-R-I, and that's a sci-fi based game that they had there. Then they talk about Dungeons and Dragons, and we're going to talk about that in more depth, and then some postal games, in particular something called Midgard. So again, Hartley Patterson is the person who puts this all together, and he says, I need a lot of content. I think he says here, I have enough for maybe one more issue where I have to do everything myself. If I don't get stuff from other people, I'm going to run out of content. He keeps going for quite a while, so either he was more productive than he thought, or maybe he'll start getting some contributions in future fanzines. Chris Beaumont, Stephen Lyons, Nick Slope, and John Martin all do artistic contributions. So all the text content is coming from Hartley. Let's take a look at some of this art. I think the art is really cool in this. Again, Chris Patterson. Am I saying that right? I'm not. Chris Beaumont art here. And then there's another piece. And then this is going to be by Stephen Lyons. Does this Plains of Infinity and Paradise butterfly. And then John Martin has this Frank Frazetta inspired lady here on the back. So let's look at the stuff that's here for Dungeons and Dragons. The first is an article at the very top here next to this dwarf, is an article on equipment and weight. And again, I think there's some idea that we need to be paying more attention to things like encumbrance. There's a number of comments down here at the bottom. They say Games Workshop is trying to put together some type of an event. A guy named Bill Howard has written in, and there's a discussion between Bill makes a comment, Luke Pulsifer, who you may recognize as a fairly known name in game design early on. And they're talking about using oil flasks and why people always throw oil and then throw a torch. Why don't they sort of set up like a Molotov cocktail type of arrangement? So Bill and Lou and the author here, Hartley, are talking about that. One of them says that their ruling is oil is like napalm, so you can do that. Another one says no. In my game, oil doesn't work like that. So if you try to create a Molotov cocktail, it's not even going to work. I thought that was kind of interesting. Okay, so a couple other things that were in here I did mention. One was a comment, just again, remember the wood grain box are early days of Dungeons and Dragons. So there's questions in here about how often you can cast spells in a day. Someone's explaining this comes from Jack Vance, where you can really only use the spells once a day. This is before character sheets. The guy's talking about his homemade character sheet, which he's got. He's actually selling. If you send him self-addressed stamps, he'll send you some of his character sheets, which sound like they're just like on a little note card, just have attributes on there. But he says, I've heard that Games Workshop is coming out with one, but we haven't seen any character sheets yet. So that's kind of interesting to think. This is before the day anybody really had a form of character sheet out there. Okay, and then there's a question in here about experience points and for magical items, and there's a debate about whether you should get experience points for the magic items, or the magic item is the reward, or do you only get experience points if you sell them? I think in my campaign sometimes, you can get the gold pieces if you sell them, and then that translates into XP. Or you can keep it, and then I think that's the way I do it from the AD&D course, but that's first edition. That's not these older rules. And then we have this thing, it's called Fanarzel's Guide to Dungeons, and it's just a made-up name, and he's the author's talking, Hartley's talking about ideas for DMs to keep in mind. He says, think about your dungeon design. Is this going to be sort of something that makes sense in terms of why things are there? What's the background story? How do these monsters get there? Or do you not care? And you're just going to sort of like by the book, like roll randomly, just stock this thing full of random stuff. When they come through, remember this is the days where you have multiple level dungeons, right? So as they come back through the dungeon time and time again, does it fill back up with monsters or does it remain empty? There's something weird at play where the levels might shift while they're gone, and so level 1 doesn't look like it used to. Those are some early day ideas about dungeon mastering these massive multi-level dungeons. He talks about the common idea of having like an area full of orcs with a captain or chieftain in there, area of kobolds, area of goblins. That's another idea you might want to do. It's interesting, he says here, question for the dungeon master: will you allow your players to make a map? And will you design a dungeon that's going to be easy to map, or do you want to make it confusing? And then he's got some random charts he suggests here that you could roll just to make things interesting. Just randomly roll what the rooms look like what color are the walls, are there tapestries, paintings, plain, otherworldly stuff come into the campaign for you. So again, just some ideas of helping early day dungeon masters come up with ideas of how to create their dungeons, because there really wasn't any guide to that. You learn from other players, I think, for the most part. Okay. And then at the very back, it's not in the table of contents, but there are some monsters, and you all know I love monsters. So Martin Easterbrook has 2. The Snark, which is a dragon without a breath weapon that comes from another universe, he says, and so just use that idea and let the dragon make up random stuff. Or the creature, the Snark, have random stuff that occurs around it. Weird effects, right, that wouldn't be normal. Goat's cheese, which is a gonzo one. It's just has the smell of goat's cheese, and if you set it on fire, it kind of burns up and then it stinks, and everybody's got to make a save or be sort of nauseous for a period of time. And if it can hit you, you lose charisma points for a day, in which they point out would cause a paladin probably to lose their special paladin-based abilities until the next day because they're covered in stinky cheese. A monster inspired by Catherine Court's Dearney novels, and this is the Caradot, which is a green and red octopus from hell. Smells like hot lead, it's evil, and it hits you and can paralyze you if it hits you with one of its tentacles. And then a giant bird creature they're calling a banshee, that's inspired by Marion Zimmer Bradley's Darkover books. And it's a large flightless bird that screeches and like a banshee and can cause fear, causing people to run away. So that's basically it. So that's it for news from Bree, number 18, from way back in 1976. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed the series. And as a reminder, please, if you're not already subscribed, please do. If you'd like to get notice of future videos that we're doing, and if you've got friends who might be interested in this kind of vintage RPG stuff, please feel free to send them our way. Hopefully they'll enjoy our videos and they can subscribe as well. Until next time, my friends, keep rolling 20s.